has done time, not for the DUI, but has done time. How many people here know someone who works as a corrections officer or in a prison? Well, that's pretty good. Where I live, everybody in this room, and the room would be full, would raise their hand. So I'm glad to see that there's some exposure to this question. You know, we think of people who live less tidy lives than we do perhaps who go to prison as people who are having some story that's separate from our own. And this panel addresses the fact that although there is a huge chasm in the realities and expectations of life among people in this country, that our fates are still very much more closely intertwined, the incarcerated and the free, than we like to think. And so this panel will address some of these questions. Going from left to right, David Cohen, partner in Bay Area criminal law, criminal defense attorney in private practice, and also, I believe, a federal public defender. Taraneh Kayhani, or Kayhani Ferdman, excuse me, consultant and legal advisor to the Secretary of Corrections of Puerto Rico in the Juvenile Division. Next to her, Michele Deitch, senior lecturer at the LBJ School of Public Affairs, University of Texas School of Law, UT Austin. And finally, Malcolm Young, whose very long CV includes time as a criminal defense attorney in Chicago, the founder of the famous Sentencing Project in DC, and currently project director of Project New Opportunity Center for Community Alternatives. So I hand this discussion over to them, and ready to answer some questions back.
Hello, everybody. I'm David Cohen again from the class of 1982, and the way we divided it up is we have 10 minutes each. So that's really good news for you guys because I'm limited to 10 minutes. I have up here on the Elmo an outline that I put together that isn't exactly following everything we're going to be talking about, but it does have information in it about the cost of incarceration, the public cost of incarceration, the private cost of incarceration, some options as to that. Also, the chasms that are caused by being a convict, the racial disparity in terms of incarceration, that the criminal justice system is biased against poor people, and there are some links here to articles. So the reason I put this together is just so you could have this information, and I have some copies of the outline here for anybody who's interested. The links to the articles, which really have tremendous amounts of information and details and statistics about this area are here. And none of us are going to have enough time to go into any of this. So we wanted to have this as a resource for anybody to take a look at this area because it's an extremely important area and has a tremendous effect as everybody's going to be telling you about on our society. Just a couple of very basic statistics that are in these materials, just so we can kind of set the table. 77 million people in the United States have a criminal record. They're either in the criminal justice system or were in the criminal justice system. That's almost 1/3 of the population. Of this 77 million people that are part of the criminal justice system, 35% are white, 38% are African American, 21% are Latino. Whites in the population are 62%. African Americans in the population are 13%. Latinos are 17%. This translates into, out of 100,000 African Americans, 1,408. Out of 100,000 Latinos, 378. Out of 100,000 Caucasians, 275. So there's a tremendous, like I keep using the word tremendous, but there's a tremendous disparity here. And the amount of individuals incarcerated in the United States since the 70s has gone up by 700%. The society is estimated, the country is estimated to be spending $80 billion a year on incarceration. there are 2.4 million people in the United States in prisons and jails as we sit here today. So those statistics are some of the kind of highlights of the importance of the problem, the issue. I'm a criminal defense lawyer, and for over 30 years, I've kind of had experience, kind of hands-on experience with this issue. I started off my practice in New York City at a white-collar firm, but I quickly went to, because I wanted to get more trial experience, I went to the Federal Defender's Office in San Diego, and then I opened a practice in San Diego. I'm down in San Francisco, but I'm a certified specialist in criminal law in California, and I've been doing criminal defense and trial practice, appellate practice, writ practice for my entire career. Spend a Sunday at a jail in the Bay Area, and you'll see how lives are ripped apart. Spend a Sunday at, for example, Elmwood, which is in South Santa Clara County. I'm just picking out Elmwood, but any one of the jails in these Bay Area counties. And what do you see? You see a packed entry area. Packed with who? Women. Packed with who? Children. Women who are African American, women who are Latinas, and children who are African American, and children who are Latinos. That's what you see. That's who's in the waiting area. And they wait, and they wait, and they wait. And eventually, after filling out all the forms and passing all the tests and going through security, they and their kids get to see the man who's in there for what have you, for a very short period of time. Sometimes they're allowed to touch each other, sometimes they can kiss briefly, and then the family goes home. Now, people can say that there are changes in the United States one way or the other, but at least what I see, it started off this way and it's increased this way. And remember, I practice in the Bay Area. The Bay Area is not exactly known to be Alabama in terms of criminal justice. We're supposedly open-minded and liberal and all these things. And I'm talking about the Bay Area. What happens when somebody is arrested? It rips apart their life. It rips apart their family. All of a sudden, the money is being spent on lawyers, on bail, on court fees, on restitution. All of a sudden, the whole focus is, how's brother gonna get out? Where's brother gonna be? I've personally had experience with how Gideon versus Wainwright, the Supreme Court case that gave everybody a right to a lawyer in this country, it was in 1964 that a different Supreme Court said in Gideon versus Wainwright, all individuals are entitled to a lawyer whether or not they can afford one. I've personally seen that while that's a tremendous ideal, it's an incredible ideal, and it's wonderful, and the opinion is wonderful, it doesn't really play out. Because as one of the recent articles that you'll see in these materials points out, in the state of Louisiana, there's enough money for only $200 a case for the public defender. And this is not unusual. Louisiana's a bad example, but there's a lot of states and a lot of areas where it's a very, very bad example. There's not enough money, there's not enough lawyers, there's not enough resources for there to be the defense of the blacks and the browns and the minorities who are making up such a high percentage of the criminal justice system. And I know for a fact that when a case is defended properly, when experts are hired, when lawyers, more than one lawyer is on the case, research can be done, motions can be filed, the outcomes can be completely different. Everybody has a right to allocute. That means to talk to the judge personally at their sentencing hearing. I've handled a lot of sentencing hearings. I've been present next to individuals who have been sentenced to prison for 10 or 15 or 20 years or more. I've been present when I had to talk to their brothers and their mom and their kids to try to explain what had just happened. And when the families get up and when they talk to the judge and they write their letters, it kind of sets the scene. And then the person charged, the defendant, gets up and talks and pleads for his liberty and pleads for his life. And there's, you know, some of the most moving moments of my life have been listening to these statements, because many times they're eloquent. But inevitably, the judge says, well, thank you, I appreciate that, and I appreciate your sentiments. And then the sentence is handed down. And the state prison is in the future for many years for many of these individuals. So I'm hoping to set the table a little bit for this panel. It's a tremendous, it's a wonderful panel, and I think that some of the other participants may be a little bit more optimistic than I, but I don't know how to address this question about chasm. First of all, I didn't know how to pronounce chasm, as I earlier was telling, as I was earlier saying, I said chasm, and my dad, who's 94, pointed out it's chasm, not chasm, but chasm, I don't know how to address it, other than to say, I think it's really, really important that we understand it. I think it's really important that we understand it. Talking about how we're going to bridge it is maybe something else. But to understand that individuals that as a regular matter have this part of life in their family, in their life, in their approach, and then there's a lot of other people who don't, or if they do have an experience, it's more of an anomaly, and they're able to afford to somehow figure it out. So I think the most important thing is to understand it, and understand its importance. Anyway, I'm sure I'm over 10 minutes. Thanks.
Hello, I'm Taraneh Ferdman. Against this presentation of David that literally takes the wind out of you, what I'm about to talk about is actually a little bit more positive and encouraging, and it has to do with the the changing nature of juvenile institutions and population in Puerto Rico, but also nationally, and the trend has been in the direction of decline, and that's been a very positive. It's helpful to put this issue, to give a bit of a context, historical context to the juvenile justice history. In the 1980s and 90s, that was the era that was known as the tough on crime era. And it was marked by a rise in crimes committed by children and adolescents. And as a response to the rising crime, the state legislators and policymakers responded by passing laws that made the juvenile system more punitive, and they allowed younger children and adolescents to be transferred to adult jails. And the result of these efforts was that it led to an exponentially increased arrests and incarceration of minors, and it ballooned the population of juveniles in confinement. The turn of century brought about a shift, and it was for the better. It was towards juvenile justice reform, and basically policymakers started to reconsider practices and policies of the previous era that heavily relied on confinement. And so it also marked the beginning of comprehensive reform and emergence of consent decrees, citing unconstitutional conditions existing in youth detentions and treatment facilities. Public attitudes were also shifting towards less punitive policies, and so legislators started to implement sentencing reform so that non-serious, non-violent offenses would be reassigned as misdemeanors rather than felonies, consequently leading to fewer convictions. At the same time, as part of this reform shift, there were also policies that were focusing on the government spending more, investing in things like counseling, education, job training, and more interest in developmentally appropriate approaches to more evidence-based methods and more cost-effective approaches to incarceration. For example, trying to restore jurisdiction back to the juvenile courts, creating diversion programs that would divert youth away from the system, and shifting resources to more community-based alternatives. And all of these efforts basically resulted in a steady decline in the population of juveniles that were incarcerated. According to one data from the Office of Juvenile Justice Delinquency Prevention, there was a 53% drop in juvenile population in large facilities between 2000 and 2014. Focusing on Puerto Rico, where I've had basically all of my experience, there were also, I can speak to significant developments that have led to very positive changes in both the conditions of youth confinement and also to just the consistent decline in the population in our facilities. The first one is the consent decree, the fact that we actually had that acted as a blueprint and provided a structure for improving services and conditions. Secondly, we had a federal monitor who came with a unique monitoring model, and that also set the stage for some significant improvements. And lastly, the youth population in our facilities dropped consistently over the years, and in part due to some of the programs and the initiatives that the agency and the Commonwealth came up with, but there were also independent reasons for that had to do with factors such as immigration. I'll be able to dig into that a little bit later. So speaking about the consent decree and its importance in the context of Puerto Rico, in 1994, the United States Department of Justice conducted investigations into conditions of confinement in our juvenile institutions and found unconstitutional conditions ranging from lack of medical and mental health care, presence of unsanitary and unsafe conditions throughout facilities, absence of sufficient beds, mattresses, and overall a lack of proper mechanisms to identify, investigate, and implement measures. And that led to a court-ordered consent decree requiring the Commonwealth to implement a series of remedial measures. But it didn't end there. There were additional investigations and litigation, and 3 years later, in 1997, the Commonwealth entered into a settlement agreement with the United States, and the agreement covered a wider range of areas, anywhere from facility construction, code, fire, life safety, policy procedures, staffing, staff training, classification, mental health, substance abuse, disciplinary system, allegations of abuse, education, among others, over 100 stipulations. And so this really provided a very complete and comprehensive work structure for the agency. At the same time, in 2002, we had a new monitor who came on board with a very different approach to monitoring. The previous monitor basically was of the opinion that, or he saw his role as one who went to the facilities, did his evaluations, and directly reported to court without really much engagement with the agency or its staff. The monitor who came on board and when it was approved proposed a collaborative monitoring approach, one where he brought his expert area consultants, and he basically required that, or requested that they team up with the agency experts. And therefore, the staff the agency staff had a direct role and involvement in designing, building protocols and creating a system, an internal auditing system that was meant to be sustainable and to be able to outlive the life of the consent decree or the monitoring process. The benefit of this monitoring model was that it provided basically a sense of ownership for the agency staff, who didn't just see instructions and ideas coming from other jurisdictions and being basically transplanted onto our system, but one that because of the direct participation of our experts, they believed in, and also as a result, people in the administration at high levels were very receptive to and would accept and implement them. So this was directly helped our process in terms of being able to reach compliance and create systems that were durable. We started, just to backtrack, in 2002. We had just under 1,000 youth. We had 16 facilities spread out throughout the island, some in very remote places. And we also had one facility just for kids age 13 and younger. And in fact, we had quite a number of kids, ages 8 and 9 years old. Today, we are down to 4 facilities. Our population is just over 200. And we have been able to complete our compliance and termination of over 3/4 of the consent decree. And the trend is expected to continue. We just had I just sat in a presentation on analysis for the next 6 months, and the view is that the numbers will continue to drop, which has obviously helped us. As an independent factor, it has helped us over the last 5 to 10 years because, of course, as you have fewer youth in your system, you have more flexibility, you are able to close facilities, consolidate, and improve services, and also, obviously, deal directly with the issue of staffing and supervision. Some of the factors for this consistent drop, and this has been going on since actually 1999, which from that point up to today, we're talking about almost 80% drop in population. There is immigration is one factor, although it hasn't really been studied. And the other factors are basically police and judges, juvenile judges, just kind of looking the other way, just not really interested in pursuing juveniles when they've had infractions or there have been situations there hasn't really been any formal public policy actually that has been at the root of this decline. But at the end, I think that we're really in much better place, and the conditions today compared to 2000 are remarkably different and improved. So it's really a very good and positive story to be able to share.
Great. Thank you, Taraneh and David. Excellent. It's wonderful to have this topic of incarceration be featured at our reunion. I've been working on issues related to prison reform and mass incarceration for 30+ years, and for virtually all of that time, I've seen the issue go from one that's marginalized and more of a niche issue to one that's really regularly featured in the media and much more on the minds of regular citizens. So I think the fact that this topic is being heard today is really a reflection of that sea change. As someone who both teaches in this area and who works on these issues very closely with the Texas legislature on criminal justice policy reforms, and Texas, of course, is a state that many consider ground zero for this issue, I've seen up close and personal the impact of what our panel description describes as, terms irrationally exuberant incarceration or imprisonment. So I want to spend some time today talking about what mass imprisonment really looks like. I can tell you about people being kept for weeks in local jails because they can't raise $500 in bail while they're awaiting trial for low-level misdemeanors. And I can tell you about others who are getting locked up because they can't afford to pay off their tickets or their fines or their fees. And those fees and fines and tickets can snowball, and they can amount to thousands of dollars for a simple infraction. It's modern-day debtors' prisons that we've created. We've really criminalized poverty. The impact of even short-term incarceration like that is severe. The person can lose the job that they just got because they can't show up for work the next day. Or they need to scramble. The single mom has to scramble to find a relative or a neighbor to pick up her kids from daycare after she gets arrested. She has to make dozens of calls to figure out who's going to watch her kids while she spends the next few weeks in jail sitting out her fines. I could tell you about people who are dying in custody, literally hours of their arrest, just because they didn't get access to their life-saving medications, or because they were intoxicated on drugs or alcohol and they didn't have appropriate medical supervision, because the jail didn't have appropriate suicide prevention strategies. We could talk about the fact that jails have become the new asylums. They're the largest mental health facilities in each state. Community-based mental health services are sorely underfunded, and so we've tasked the criminal justice system with filling that gap, despite the misfit. Jails are not the right place for people with mental illness. People with severe mental illness make up an estimated 30% of local jail inmates. They're exceptionally vulnerable in the jail. They cause management problems for the staff, and they're not receiving the treatment that they so desperately need. They cycle in and out of the jails. They're the frequent flyers of the local criminal justice system, and that's happening at great personal harm to them and at great cost to taxpayers. And we don't have to look very far to see the harms that are caused by over-imprisonment at the local pretrial level. Think about Sandra Bland as the perfect example of that. She's the motorist in Texas who was arrested for not signaling properly and was taken to the jail where she died from suicide. We can think about that, but what about mass incarceration at the deep end of the system? For the state-run prisons where we are holding inmates who have been convicted of felony offenses. That's a world that I came to know really well as a court-appointed monitor of conditions in the Texas prison system. And I also return regularly to these facilities with my students, so it's a world I know well. Well, I can tell you what it's like to visit one of these Texas prisons. And Texas prisons as a whole hold over 150,000 inmates. I could talk about what it feels like to pass through the double razor-wired topped fences and enter the steel doors that are providing a glimpse into a world that few of us see. What it's like to pound the pavements of a quarter-mile long hallway, a colorless, echoing hallway with endless cell blocks and clanging doors and a constant din and institutional cooking smells. I could tell you what it feels like to be in there in the sweltering 100-degree-plus heat in the summer, in the non-air conditioned prison units that have led to a number of inmates dying from heat stroke in recent years. I can tell you what it's like to go into the count rooms at the front of each prison, where they use color-coded tags to indicate the race of the inmates, because race pervades everything in prison. And how you note on the count boards the overwhelming numbers of Black and Hispanic inmates that are assigned to the solitary confinement areas, because you could see it at a glance just by the colors of those little tags. We could talk about what it's like to go into the geriatric unit that houses prisoners aged 55 and older, some of them, not all of them. 55 is considered old in prison. That's our year in college, just to be clear. 55 is considered old in prison because of the way your body ages there due to a lifetime of poor medical care and unhealthy lifestyles. It's like walking into a nursing home. There's white-haired, frail men in wheelchairs, many of them missing limbs or they're blind. There are men on 5 times a week dialysis, men in hospice care. These are the prisoners we're keeping locked up at extraordinary financial costs and human costs because of our extreme penchant for retribution, keeping them locked up long beyond their crime-prone years. We could talk about solitary confinement, administrative segregation in prison terminology. What does it mean to be locked up in a space that is 8 foot by 5 foot, about the size of a typical bathroom? And you're in there for 23 plus hours per day, up to 20, 30 years on end. Think about that. We could talk about how that kind of extreme isolation breaks the human spirit, how it creates or worsens mental health problems for the people who live there, how it renders them unable to reintegrate into society when they're eventually released, sometimes directly from those conditions to the streets, how they're unable to handle the normal noises of the community or even human physical contact, how they jump when someone touches them. We could also talk about the relentless boredom of prison life, the missed opportunities to provide inmates with meaningful work opportunities, with programs that could help them overcome their addictions, and treatment for the trauma that they've experienced, because as Jeffrey Wright was talking about earlier, so many people come into prison with a lifetime of trauma that preceded them. We could talk about how we deprive inmates of the opportunity to exercise autonomy over any aspect of their time in prison, and yet how we expect them to make healthy choices upon their release when they leave that setting, not having given them any opportunity to do so for 20 or more years. We could talk about the fear that is always present in the cell blocks that we pass as we walk down the hallways, the risk of sexual assault by other inmates or staff, the pressure to join gangs, the need to prove yourself by fighting so no one messes with you, the need to protect your meager possessions from theft or extortion. I could tell you about the inmates' neglected medical conditions, about cancers treated with aspirin, about the heart attacks and the strokes that are ignored by staff because they think the inmates are faking it, about the lack of access to doctors or mental health professionals, and about how this appalling medical care worsens the inmates' physical health and contributes to escalating medical costs in the community when these inmates get released. And I would be remiss if I didn't talk about the impact of these conditions on prison staff members, whose environmental working conditions are atrocious, and who often need to work incredible overtime hours because of staffing shortages, who live in fear of inmate violence, and who have internalized the us versus them mentality that pervades these environments. Many of you have probably heard of author Ted Conover, who was an Amherst grad from 1980. He spent a year as a corrections officer at Sing Sing Prison, and he wrote a book about his experiences called New Jack that I highly recommend. And in that book, he recounts the way in which, while he was a prison officer, he started treating his family differently. He was yelling at his kids. He was barking out orders to his family. He also highlights the fact that prison staff have high rates of family violence and drinking problems and divorce. So when we talk about exuberant incarceration in our country, about the fact that 2.3 million people are locked up in such appalling conditions, we also need to ask what the impact of such punitive practices is on the keepers as well as on the kept. We need to consider the impact of these practices on the communities where the inmates return, the social and the financial impacts of untreated medical and mental health problems, and of the trauma that people are experiencing in prison that they now need to deal with on the outside. We need to remember that 95% of inmates are coming back to the communities, and if they are made worse by their experiences, then this harms all of us. We need to look at the impact on communities of color, that are so disproportionately affected by our incarceration policies, and by impoverished neighborhoods that bear the burden of absorbing the large numbers of inmates who typically can't find jobs when they get back. But they're all coming back to the same neighborhoods. How does that affect those neighborhoods? And we need to understand the budgetary consequences of mass imprisonment. $3 billion, with a B, billion dollars a year in Texas alone. That's money that's not being spent on schools, on mental health, on health care, foster care, jobs programs, urban renewal. Underfunding in all of those other areas is contributing to the population pressures in prison. It's all too easy to ignore what's going on in our nation's prisons and jails, in part because they're out of sight and out of mind, and so lacking in transparency. But what happens in prison doesn't stay in prison. It spills out into the community, and we face it in the form of high recidivism rates, public safety issues, and high costs for taxpayers. Part of my goal for today in this conversation was to make the invisible visible, so we understand what mass incarceration looks like. And although we've started to make very critical improvements in some parts of the criminal justice system, conditions issues in prisons and jails have seemed extremely resistant to change. And understanding what's going on in our prisons is the first step towards reforming them.
Well, I need to move this. First of all, from the class of 1968 to the class of 1982 that is hosting this and inviting me here today, thank you very much and congratulations. I was impressed at the beginning when a number of people held up their hands when they were asked if anyone had known someone who had been incarcerated. That wouldn't have happened a number of years ago. Either people wouldn't have admitted it or it just wouldn't have happened because people weren't involved. And now in the world of mass incarceration, unfortunately many more people are. Not that that was impressive. I also don't think we would have had hands held up, at least when I was in here, when we were asked if people were involved with corrections or were corrections officers. And there was at least one exuberant response. And that's good to see, because that was a light that we didn't know about at one point. I'm glad to follow the other panelists because they've done a wonderful job of describing juvenile and adult corrections, the impact and the costs to the people involved. But I want to speak about a unique experience I've had after 4 decades of working on the sentencing side of things, where David was and Michele was, to an opportunity I've had in the last couple of years to direct this office, Project New Opportunity. I want to tell you how this opportunity came about and introduce you to the people that I work for and with. About 3 years ago, there were 2 initiatives in federal criminal justice. One was the United States Sentencing Commission adjusted sentencing for drug cases downward and made that sentencing downward adjustment retroactive. And that had an impact on now 30,000 people who've been released on average 2 years ahead of schedule, a reduction of on average from 12 to 10 years of incarceration. And then there was President Obama's efforts to release people through clemency. About 1,700 individuals were released through clemency. 300 or more of them were life sentences. They were to have died in prison, except federal prison, except for clemency. There was concern because neither of these groups had been prepared for release, being that they were being released ahead of schedule. So ultimately, I was asked, and then became involved, and now direct this Project New Opportunity to try to, what do we do to help these people come out? And what we do in my office are about 4 things. First of all, we reach back to people as soon as we know, as we can, as soon as they get a hold of us, and start to work with them in advance of their release date. In the federal system, you could be imprisoned one place in the country and you maybe live hundreds or thousands of miles away, so there's no contact, and maybe nobody else in your prison is going back to where you are. So there's no communication or connection between where people are coming out and where they've been housed in prison. So we were to work to try to offset that. We were then trying to figure out what each individual's situation was. We counsel, advise, and guide them, and we connect them to local resources that will help them when they come out. And last, and maybe most important, most of the people who work in my office are themselves formerly incarcerated people. They've lived the life, and they've made the transition, and they know how to talk to and help people coming out of prison. So our job, basically, is to get to know our clients, federal prisoners who served 8, 10, 12, sometimes more years, and now are coming out. And I just want to tell you what my impressions are now with about 140 clients under our belt. I was amazed, surprised, that this group of people were in their communications, oral and in writing, courteous, appreciative, and respectful. They were very obviously motivated and eager to succeed. There was no lack of intelligence among them, insofar as one could make such a judgment. Many appeared, were insightful, observant, and aware of reactions of other people. And I, of course, have learned that, as you may suspect, this is necessary if you're in prison, because the mistake in a judgment of someone else can be injurious or even fatal in a prison environment. And as Michele described, there's no need to elaborate, but it's not an easy life and it is risky. Most of our clients are ambitious, maybe unrealistically so, given that they don't have licenses and aren't equipped to do certain things that they want to do. So what's the problem? Well, this is the other side of what we see. And most of it is the damage from the long-term incarceration that they've experienced. They're isolated, they're desocialized, especially men relating to women when they come out of prison. They don't know how to get along with girlfriends or wives anymore. They don't know how to explain themselves. They're very private. They want to go lock themselves into a room away from the family, and the families don't understand this, and tension rises. They're not used to making decisions. They've been deprived of even picking a time to take a shower, and certainly to choose which item you're going to take off the grocery store shelf. And after a period of years of not making decisions, you become disabled. You're unable to do that. Some of them are slightly paranoid. They begin to see correction officers on the streets, or imagine probation officers, someone who will write them a ticket and violate them if they make the smallest mistake. That's the way they've been living for years, and they're not used to living without that kind of supervision. They're intimidated by technology. They're intimidated by the expenses that they have, because they were paid very little money in prison. Most of them had very little money. But things where the prices were controlled, and now they're seeing prices on the street that are many times what they're used to paying, and they're not used to being expected to be paid what they will be paid if they can find employment. Many of them are unrealistic and uninformed in their expectations. For instance, a woman who wants to go into daycare has no concept that she needs to get licenses, and she'll have to overcome the problem of having a conviction. So there are signs that in a layperson's mind, I would say, of post-traumatic stress. And they're impatient at bureaucratic delays, and are not used to having delays imposed upon them, because in prison everything happens. They tell you what's going to happen, and it happens. So how does this play out? I've talked to women. A woman who couldn't work, was afraid she was going to lose her job because she couldn't face customers in the convenience store that hired her. She just couldn't look people in the eye, and her employer was beginning to pick up on this, and that she wasn't a suitable employee. I've talked to people, and my people who work with me have talked to other people who are afraid to cross the street, who don't know how to ride public transportation and can't get from point A to point B in time to make a meeting. They don't know what to wear for clothes or how to dress. They don't know what to say to people when they're asked what they feel are intrusive or personal questions, and they overreact and tend to fear that they're going to then lose jobs or lose opportunities. What pervades is a fear of failure, of wanting to find a place, wanting to succeed, and being fearful that they're not equipped to do it. They're not able to take the next step toward, to do whatever they have to do, move toward assimilating back into the broader society. In my description that I've given you, you didn't hear the word criminal, although all of these folks are convicted criminals. That's not the impression that you have, that's not the feeling that you have when you're talking to them, when you're watching how people work with them to get through their lives and solve their problems. You hear instead the voices of people who did things when they were younger that they regret, that were bad and got them into trouble. But there were people, by and large, who didn't have the kind of counsel, the advice, the support that most of us in this room would give to our own children if they were in trouble. And some of us in this room certainly have encountered, not us, our friends, children, young people who've been suicidal, been depressed, used drugs, stolen things at one point or another, gotten into trouble with their peers, resisted teachers, resisted instruction in school. And most of us, when that happens, or our friends, when it happens to them, fight for our children. We employ experts, we send them to see counselors, we do whatever we can do to protect them. We don't, however, use the instruments of the agencies of criminal justice, which are the agencies that are used for the people I'm looking for now, were used for them from their very young, from their youth on through. I don't think if I asked anyone to hold up their hand, I'd see any hands if I asked how many people know someone or had someone, a young person in their family who was in trouble, who thought to refer them to the county probation office. Okay? We go to private and other resources. But the people I'm seeing at Project New Opportunity, most of them never had that opportunity. They were in the criminal justice system and the juvenile justice system that you've heard described. And even now, as they come out, the agencies that are set up to help them have a priority not on helping them advance and realize their goals and their ideals, which they express to us freely. The agencies and organizations in criminal justice, probation, parole, re-entry programs, set goals of reducing recidivism or keeping the community safe, which is fine. We want that. But when you're trying to get a job, or when an employer is hiring someone for a job, the employer's goal, to hire you, to train you, is not to see that you avoid getting arrested for something, but to train you to do a good job, a better job. And if you succeed at that, it's assumed you're not going to get into trouble. Well, the picture I'm trying to paint is of a group of people coming out of prison who are striving for the same thing that you and I or our children would strive for, but are wrapped up in the instrumentalities, the agencies of criminal justice, and are affected by that in every step of their lives, and affected adversely. And there's a cost to us. That is the talents, the capabilities, the creativity that we see in our clients was lost to the society while they were youth, while they were in trouble in the juvenile and criminal justice system, and then for those years that they were incarcerated. And that's the cost of mass incarceration as I see it. Not just, or not only the dollar cost that we've heard something about, not only the cost to the individual, which Michele described, but the cost, the social cost to a society that is moving people into a prison and a criminal justice system and away from the opportunities in the larger society. So that's my take, and I don't know whether I'm optimistic or pessimistic, but I think it depends on how people like us in this room react, whether we accept the situation as it is or ask for change. Did I go over my time? Is that why the mic went off?
No.
We have time for a few questions.
based, not entirely, but to a large extent around race. And I think we understand that since Reconstruction, really, target of criminal justice system in this country has been race-based. But there were class overlaps as well. I think there are some of us now who, as we see in this recent election and the current political discourse, are quite comfortable with that racial targeting, but might be less comfortable with the class targeting. So in terms of messaging, is there a way that we can better frame the discussion around class in terms of what are the statistics for income, incarceration relative to income, and not to strip away from the equation the race dynamic, but to overlay class in a very clear way so that the messaging is understood on another level by those who might be more accepting of class targeting by the criminal justice system.
Let me just try to answer that. I think that in this outline, one of the things that is in here is that the criminal justice system is biased against poor people. And I think that several of us have talked about how, putting aside race, there are people that are in jail because they can't make bail. There are people that are in jail because they didn't get the right defense during the time that they were charged, because I was talking about Gideon versus Wainwright, the underfunding of public defenders' offices, people who can't afford the correct representation. There was discussion about how if there were the correct experts in the community, that people would turn to those experts and not necessarily the criminal justice system. So there's no doubt that the criminal justice system is biased against poor people, that the vast majority of the people that end up in the criminal justice system are there because they're poor. You can take race out of it. So that's certainly a very quick and clear way that maybe you could redirect the discussion, or one could.
I can tell you that in Texas, you don't talk about race. That argument doesn't fly at all if you're working on advocacy around these issues, but class is starting to matter. So this legislative session, issues about bail reform and people being locked up because they can't raise that $500 for bail, or the people who, the debtor's prison issue, that those issues were front and center on the criminal justice reform front, and race doesn't ever get mentioned.
Thank you. I mean, just as a brief up, because I think among all of us, including myself, there's an easy assumption of poverty being a pathway to criminality. And I'm just curious how we can, in terms of our understanding and our thinking and our discussion and our messaging, decouple that idea, decouple those two dynamics from one another.
Well, it's such a big question, and it's a good question, so that's why it's tough to answer. I mean, it's interesting to see the different reactions to opioid.
That's a very good example.
Deaths. Okay, it's much more of a medical reaction. Who are the victims? And many more poor white people, and so that's interesting. But there may be other factors involved. I also think it's a complex picture, because it's not just that it's race and poverty those things cause people to get in criminal behavior. I think it's the larger part is, how does the society respond to those groups wherever they are, north, south, urban, rural? How does it respond? And when the response is to institutionalize and to channel people into punitive and control-oriented institutions, then you get what we have in criminal justice, and it ends in over-incarceration. And that response is more common for minorities, for black people in many settings, and certainly out of the South. And it's also common for poor people in many settings, including the South, which is why in the South you have many states have less of this disparity in rate, disparity in the incarceration of African Americans in some northern states, because they also lock up poor people a lot too, whereas some of the northern states lock up fewer poor people, but managed to lock up proportionally a much larger number of African Americans. The number's so small it's not noticed unless you look at it. So I'm sorry to go on. I mean, the challenge in your question is we could spend a long time on it, and it's complex. I mean, you know, we're at Amherst College, so you can go back and talk about this, you know, criminal justice was, he came here to see how it was a democracy used criminal justice to respond to disparate voices in the democracy. And race is tied up with disparate voices because of the oppositional relationship between whites and blacks that goes way back. So, and I don't know if I'm making myself clear, and we could go on a long time, so we better not, right? I mean, thank you for the question. It's right on.
Curious if you believe there's anything we can learn from other countries' approach to this issue, whether it's Scandinavia, Europe, or anywhere really where you think that they try some innovative things that work better, because obviously they have much lower incarceration rates and lower rates of violence. Maybe it's such a cultural difference that it doesn't apply here, but I don't think we can learn something. I don't know.
Well, we could go almost anywhere to learn something. The United States is pretty far out there on these issues. Scandinavia, you mentioned, is an excellent example. Very, very different views towards incarceration and both how many people we lock up, how long we lock them up for, and what it looks like when they're there. One thing that's very, very different about imprisonment in other countries is that they have a sense that when you take a year away from someone, that is a really huge deal. We hand out sentences of 20 years, 30 years here like they're nothing, and the difference between 20 and 30 is nothing. That's just a negotiated figure. And whereas, you know, other countries might have 20 years as the maximum you could get for anything. And we understand that that is an incredibly painful thing to do, to take time away out of someone's life. And then the time that they spend in these settings, a lot of times you might be really, you know, knowing what we know prisons look like. If you go into a prison in Scandinavia, it doesn't even look like a prison here. Inmates are walking around, they have families coming and visiting, they may have, you know, overnight or weekend stays with their family, they're working on projects, they're taking classes. They're kept away from the community. Their freedom is limited, but it is not in such a punitive sort of way.
But is the pushback that we don't want to make prison too attractive?
We can't even get to have that discussion.
I'm just wondering if that's a pushback.
I mean, there would be that response. I think that culturally we are a much more punitive culture in the United States, and that there's probably a lot of historical explanation for how we got to be that way. These other countries don't have that kind of history. So I would love to have that conversation with you. I've seen prisons in other places. I did my graduate work in England, working in a therapeutic community prison that was modeled on a completely different nature or understanding of what punishment looks like. So I'd love to talk more about that.
Gentleman in the back.
Oh, thank you. Dean Banfield, and I'd like to get anyone on the panel's opinion about how the recent trending towards minor drug offenses, the opioid addiction problem, has been started to be treated by most courts nationwide in sort of a therapeutic way. We're not trying to criminalize that. We're trying to find ways not to make a minor drug offense become something that's so detrimental to people, and it's helped. It's helped this incarceration problem. However, the recent administration is making a total U-turn here, and that's a concern. Is there some capacity for states to resist that directive, for the trend to continue in the direction that it's heading? Just any opinion that the panel would like to offer on that. I'm interested to hear.
Well, you know, I mean, if you're tweeting at 3 in the morning, you can't be using opiates because it would put you to sleep. You know, in California, you're right, it's been a very positive development, and for many, many years, the trend has been not to incarcerate users of drugs, to try to treat users of drugs. Many of the local courts have what are called drug courts and extended treatment programs, it's a much more enlightened view. And there's very little chance, I would think, at least many of these reforms are on the local level. I think there's very little chance that whatever it is that Attorney General Sessions does in a memo is going to affect, for the most part, what you're talking about, which has been very good and positive development over time.
I disagree. So I think it's going to have a huge impact, or it has the potential to have a huge impact. You're absolutely right to note that there have been these changes at the state level. There's a lot of reforms happening there, most of which are quite positive. But with these changes we're seeing at the federal level, I am very worried that that is going to change what's happening at the state level. On the one hand, you do have a change in viewpoint and attitude at the state level, which is good, but it hasn't translated in a very serious way into reforms. Juvenile stuff notwithstanding, this is adult side I'm talking about. So my concerns are that a lot of the reforms at the state level are pretty fragile and pretty modest, and it wouldn't take much to disrupt some of those reform efforts, number one. Number two, as the federal message that we're receiving from the Attorney General and is one of tough on crime and drugs are terrible and you've got to have this really punitive attitude towards drugs, I think that could start trickling down to the way people see those issues at the state level. For the last 10 years, we've not been hearing that tough on crime message. We've heard much more of a, we have to be smart on crime, not tough on crime. And that could really disrupt it. And third, I am very worried about what the Attorney General could do and what the federal government can do to start putting pressure on the states to toughen their sentencing in that area through either grants or through laws that say if you don't pass these tough on crime laws, we're going to withhold money. And that's what happened in the 90s, and I can see that happening again, which is why I'm so scared.
So we smiled when you asked the question. We were talking about this before the session. So I agree with Michele 100%. I think they're very perilous. The one good news is that the reaction from state people and even former federal prosecutors was stronger, pushback against Sessions, than I thought it was going to be. So that was very good. But the bad news is that now there are people, I listened to someone before I left Washington on a talk show on the radio, mainline talk show, Department of Justice guy who used to run the private prosecutors organization, was very much in favor of tough sentences. And they're basically telling lies about how valuable long sentences were and how we need to be tough on drugs, and that solved all our problems, including the problems of violent crime. And they're fact-free. And this is going we're afraid this is going to filter down quite quickly to people in the states that have, take their cues from the federal system. Also, there's 200,000 people almost in the federal prison system, not quite that many. So it's not a small system in and of itself. And they are now going to be prosecuting those folks to the maximum extent. The people I work for are not going to be available to work with because they'll be doing those life sentences and those long-term sentences without any relief.
Just to add to what Malcolm is saying, one of the reasons we've been able to turn things around to some degree at the state level over the last 10 years or so is because of the use of data and data showing what works. And this is an administration that doesn't trust data, that misuses it and misrepresents it. And if you can't use data and you can't trust the data that you're hearing about, you're not going to have anything to bolster your argument. I've said to people that the current situation, I have felt like we've been like Sisyphus, pushing a rock up a hill for many, many years, and we were finally making progress, and now that rock's just slipped down again, and we're starting again.
On that